Hello everyone and welcome back to another video created by yours truly. It's Draskyl here. We're going to be talking today more about counters. This is a game that I want to watch through the draft and then we may just go through the whole game. So for reference, this game's about 33 minutes or so, and what I want to do is talk about counters in the picking phase, how they counter specific things, what you can do to deal with it, and also the picking phase as it pertains to what hero is going to be strong in that phase and what counters what based on when it's picked. So without further ado, we're just going to go ahead and hop right in. The opener from Radiant is Wyvern Rubik. Now, when you see stuff like this, typically what you're seeing is two very defensively postured supports. So heroes that want to sit in the back, they want to cast their spells, and then they function the best when there are people who stand in front of them on their team that can either absorb damage or make the enemy focus on them rather than being able to jump onto the back line. So if we're thinking about heroes that counter Wyvern and Rubik, anything that has gap close is nice. So your Storm Spirits, your Ember Spirits, Void Spirits. Phantom Assassin can be nice later in the game as a means to get onto them from a different core perspective. And Tiny, Earth Spirit, these heroes that either naturally build Blink Dagger or they have methods of stunning and getting in close and silencing and then killing. This is all stuff that you could think about if you saw an opening like this. Now, I only saw the draft as the 5 heroes versus 5 heroes, so I don't know who picked what when. So we are going to be finding that out at a very similar point in time. So we're just going to go ahead and hit play. As reference, Rubik as a hero is not super strong right now, but Wyvern is pretty good, widely considered one of the better, more stable supports that you can pick. So if you're a 5-player, definitely a hero that you can add to your arsenal. Alright, so Tiny and Luna. Okay, so we already have a decent amount of information. We know that this is probably going to be a carry Luna due to the player. Again, this is a super high MMR game, so whenever we're thinking about how we want to go about countering, if we see a Luna and we see that it's being played in a person who predominantly plays that role, like the 1 role or the 2 role, then we kind of already know that's where the hero is going to be. Now, what does Luna do as a hero? Her laning is pretty solid. She has Lunar Blessing, which grants a lot of damage, especially at level 2. It's 15 for every ally within, I think it's 900 range. And then Lucent Beam can be used for harass, securing range creeps, all this other stuff. But more importantly, she groups up around buildings, and she has a very powerful teamfight spell coming in from the safe lane, which not a lot of heroes have. The other thing that she does is farm extremely quickly while not under pressure. Glaives are one of the fastest farming tools for any hero in the game, and if you leave her to her own devices, she is going to acquire items very fast. So what does that mean for the overall game? Now, if you're Radiant and you see this opener of Tiny Luna, you know for a fact that the Luna is going to be a core based on player. And you know that the Tiny, being picked early, there are 2 choices. It could still technically be mid, depending on player, or it could be a support. So if it is a support, it's probably going to be position 4. I haven't personally seen Tiny 5 in any game, but we know that there's already a hero that's going to create a little bit of chaos in the game because Tiny has a lot of burst damage, it's stun. It is one of the heroes that buys Blink and can theoretically get on top of the Wyvern and the Rubik. So if we're talking about counters, we've already established that there is a hero on Dire that can deal with these 2 supports that want to sit really far away from the engagement. The other thing is that Wyvern deals particularly well with 5-man because Curse becomes stronger the more heroes that are in proximity. Not only that, but she has a great deep pushing tool in Splinter Blast. And the biggest weakness she has is just heroes getting on top of her and stunning and being able to see stuff in tree lines and all this other stuff. So far, I'd say the openers, if I were to favor one, I would always favor the team that hasn't shown their core first. When you're first picking a hero as a pro player, you're typically just saying, I want to practice this hero in an adverse environment, one that's not going to be easy for me to succeed. So, we're going to go to the next phase. But just again, to kind of sum up the weaknesses, Radiant, very weak to being ran at. Like, ran at very quickly, not once every 2 minutes, just like constantly running in, constantly running in, constantly running in. That's what they are not good at dealing with. And then for Dire, their weakness is they are not the strongest in lane right now, given what we see here. Now, the first two openers, Luna is kind of strong in lane, but Tiny as a support is extremely weak. Whereas Rubik and Wyvern are both pretty average laners. Wyvern a bit better than Rubik. So we have two strong laners versus one weak laner and one strong laner. Now that we have seen the other two heroes, Pudge, again, not really that weak of a laner. Or, sorry, not that strong of a laner. And then Bounty Hunter is kind of dependent on what heroes you're up against. But I will say that in terms of gameplay style, Bounty Hunter and Pudge have something in common with Tiny as well, where they do not have cooldowns. So when you're thinking about the pace of the game and you're theorizing, what can I do to counter what this team wants? A really good way of applying pressure is picking heroes that are good at walking in and don't really rely on big cooldown ultis. Now we see Tidehunter on Radiant, so this is a hero that's very good at standing in front and defending a point, which is something that Winter, Wyvern, and Rubik love to have on their team. They want that front line, as I described earlier. But against Pudge and Bounty Hunter and Tiny, the Tide can actually be killed because of just the sheer amount of magic damage that is coming out. Now, he obviously can't see the Pudge and the Bounty Hunter until after his pick, but we have the privilege of seeing them as they come out, so we know, after having seen this, that the Tidehunter is probably going to need, at minimum, a hood in order to be able to do his job. So when it comes to counters, I'd say Bounty is one of the best in the business at laning against Tidehunter because he's extremely fast. You use Janata to deal a huge amount of damage. Kraken does not perform well against heavy hits. It performs a lot better against the slow or even rapid low damage hits. So for instance, an extreme case would be like Wind Ranger's Focus Fire, because it takes damage away from the hero and you're hitting into Kraken. That would be where Kraken thrives. But here, it's a lot of magic damage. It's a lot of heavy hitting heroes too, like Tiny's Burst, Pudge's Burst, Bounty Hunter, Janata, plus Shuriken's Burst. So even though his pick synergizes well with his team, he is countered by what Dire's heroes can do to him. So if I'm looking at drafts and I'm going, how are these heroes going to stay alive? Right now, it's just all about positioning. Like, where are the heroes standing on Radiant relative to where Dire are? Because if Dire get a little bit of momentum in a fight, it's very easy to just lose everyone because you really only have one stun outside of Ravage. And that's another great thing for Bounty Hunter to see, is a lineup that just has two supports that offer no stun. There's no hard lockdown for him other than Lift until Tide hits 6 and Wyvern hits 6. So in addition to these heroes kind of like not wanting to be ran at on Radiant, they also don't have great ways of stopping it either. So hopefully in the next couple of picks, they're able to pick something that can kind of solve that issue. Okay, so now we have a Spectre. So here's where I would say this draft, to me personally, in terms of what needs to happen in the game, I am massively favoring Dire. So we have a kind of okay laner, and the Rubik and the Wyvern. But the problem is going to start when this Luna starts grouping up by towers, and these heroes are trying to defend. Now, they do have some wave clear, which is an additional layer of the draft that you always have to keep in mind. Like Tidehunter, Wyvern, Rubik, they can blast waves, which is a really good way at holding defensive positions. You put one of these heroes behind a tower, they zap a wave, that wave dies, they keep the tower alive for a long period of time, hopefully buy space for the Spectre to be able to do stuff. The other thing about this picking phase in particular is that it's very common to encounter what we would call a blind hard counter. And all that means is that someone picks a hero without knowing what you're going to pick that just kind of destroys what your goals are within the game. So why does Spectre and Tidehunter both hate playing against Pudge and Bounty? We've kind of already talked about Tide. It's heavy magic burst. Tide doesn't have a favorable lane against the Bounty if it ends up being that way. But more importantly for Tide, he's a cooldown hero. If he doesn't have Ravage, it's really hard for him to be able to stand anywhere against this amount of magical damage and be able to feel safe. Not to mention things like Cold Embrace, which ordinarily would be used for a save against heroes that deal physical damage. They're not going to save him. Most of the time, it's probably just going to kill him because it will either line up for a hook or it will line up for a stun toss combo or whatever. So as far as defensive utility, Radiant don't really have a whole lot. And then if we move on to the Spectre, this hero needs space, right? Obviously, the Blade Mail, the Echo Saber build has come into play recently, and it's seen some moderate to decent success, but it's more about how quickly the enemy team is able to apply pressure in this sort of setting that makes me worry that a hero like Spectre will not be able to thrive. Because some hero on Radiant has to be able to stand and do something, right? Like, you can't just play a game with no frontline if you have all these heroes that can only play in the back. And the two frontline heroes right now, Spectre, granted, is a lot better at absorbing magical damage than Tide because of dispersion. But it's still not... It doesn't feel super great to play into these heroes because of how much they're going to be walking at you. So, with that being said, last picks are coming up. These are usually the picks that kind of define the game. Like, you can have a last pick either win you the game, or it can lose you the game very, very easily. But this is a very high-level game. It's like a 9.3k average, so I'm sure both of these picks will at least be decent. At least I would hope so. Alright, so we got an Invoker.
10 seconds remaining.
And then we'll see what the last pick is for
5 seconds remaining.
Dire before we talk a little bit about it. I do think the Invoker is okay, and I'll explain why. And now we see a Viper. Okay, so let's talk about the philosophies of the picks. The Invoker pick is nice because if you think about the mode of travel for every single hero on Dire, and this is a counter specifically to run at you lineups. So when you're being ran at, there's a couple of things that you can do. You can pick some stuns, right? So when they dive towers, they die to the tower. You can pick excessive amounts of wave clear, so that whenever they're running in, they're always running into creeps and they can't really get anything, and then you're buying time for some hero to get farm, which Radiant kind of does between the Wyvern, the Rubik, and the Tide. And then there's the, I'm just going to either mana drain you or keep you at arm's length by spamming like Cold Snap and Tornado and all these other spells. Because if you look at Luna, Tiny, Viper, Pudge, Bounty, like Pudge and Viper are two extremely slow heroes. Tiny is actually also below average MS. Luna and Bounty are on the fast side, but they're, you know, they're not going to buy daggers, right? Like, Pudge might eventually get a dagger in this game. I very rarely, if ever, see Viper buy anything like that. And, like, the Luna and the Bounty Hunter are definitely not going to buy them. So what does that mean? In terms of, like, fighting dynamic, if you're trying to walk into an Invoker, it's very likely that you're going to eat a bunch of spells. And those spells can just result in you more or less dying, or at the very least, you have to turn around and run away. Now, in my experience having played Invoker, I would say that most likely we're going to see Quas Wex, because we need control over the heroes that are trying to get into our backline. And there are a lot of them on Dire. So the philosophy for the Invoker this game is I want to control the pace. I want to be there when people need me so I can do my mana drain combo. I can, you know, Cold Snap, all that other cool stuff, and just buy time. Buy time, buy time, buy time. The other thing about how Invoker kind of counters the Dire lineup is there's no Dispel. Now, when you're playing Invoker, any of these heroes that have debuffs, it's always nice to play into a hero pool that does not have an innate Dispel. So there's no Press the Attack, there's no Aphotic Shield, there's no ability that they have outside of item use that's going to remove a Cold Snap. So that means when you earn Cold Snap somebody and they get hit by an Arctic Breath, that's now a combo that we can use together to theoretically kill a hero. Now, if we look at the Viper, this one is a bit more one-dimensional, but it also makes a lot of sense. If you have a hero like Bounty Hunter and you have a hero like Pudge and you have a hero like Tiny, what do these heroes want to do? They want to go in. So what needs to happen in order for those heroes to go in? Well, you need to kill the creeps. And you have to at least kill the creeps fast enough to where the wave is pushing into a tower, because that sets you up for an ideal situation to where you can dive. Now, you can look at this pick also as a somewhat experienced player and go, well, yeah, duh. Nether Toxin is great against Tidehunter and Spectre and all this other stuff. And that's true. But it's a even better pick if you think about how Dire has to take fights. They have to take fights based around the waves being pushed out, and until this pick, the only hero that really pushed waves was Luna. So if you have Bounty and you have Pudge and you have Tiny and nobody on your team can kill creeps or at least get the wave out in a decent timing, a lot of your movements around the map are going to feel awkward. They're going to be slow, or if you smoke, they're just going to miss because it becomes too obvious. 3 to 4 heroes off the map for X amount of time, and people are going to get suspicious at basically any level of Dota. So this hero kind of checks a few boxes. It gives you the wave clear. It gives you the counter to the passives on the Spectre and the Tidehunter. But this hero does also have weaknesses within this game as well. It's not like Viper doesn't have some problems. They're just choosing this avenue because it looks like too good of a Viper game to pass up. Now, Rubik is one of the best heroes in the game against Viper because you can just steal another Toxin or you can steal Viper Strike and you just put it on the Viper and then he feels really bad, right? So it kind of goes both ways in this regard. But as far as... Let's talk a little bit about game plans. Game plans for Dire, pretty straightforward. Just run at them a lot. Like, just run at them, pressure them, make them feel as uncomfortable as possible. Make them use their spells in awkward ways because we know that none of our heroes besides the Luna have really lengthy cooldowns. Like, Viper Strike is not the longest cooldown. Obviously, Track is very short. Dismember is like 30 seconds, I think, even at level 1. Like, all these spells come up quickly. So what's the best way to utilize our lineup is we just want to run in. And obviously, we have Track, too. So when you have that extra benefit of getting the bonus gold and, applying all this pressure, it's what you would refer to as snowball-y in nature. Even if they didn't have Bounty and it was some other aggro hero, it would still be a pretty snowball-based lineup. And then for Radiant, they're buying time for the Spectre. They're trying to fight around their ultimates. So they have Winter's Curse, they have Ravage, and they have Haunt. And then they have some decent wave clear with an Invoker that I'm assuming is going to go Crossflex. We'll get into the game in just a second, so we'll get a chance to see it. And this hero is meant as a means to like bridge the gap between when our abilities are off cooldown and when they're on cooldown. So it just means that having some mid hero that plays a quick game that is what we will call non-committal, and what that means is you don't have to throw your body into the enemy team to be effective. When someone says a committal hero, what they're saying is, a hero like Tiny who blinks forward and uses his spells, and then once those spells are down, that fight is either won or lost, right? That's a full commitment. But Invoker is nice because he doesn't have to go in. He can throw his spells from a distance, and they still offer CC, and they still offer utility, and they still offer damage. So it's a good solution for when you're not sure how much time you're going to be able to buy to pick a hero that is not going to put themselves in harm's way just by using their kit. And it's important when you have also these lineups that have really long cooldowns to have a hero like that. Now, are there other heroes that could do the same job as Invoker this game? There might be, but I think Invoker is probably one of the better heroes at halting aggression, just at a base value. And he's also one of the lower cooldown heroes on top of that. So, we've talked a little bit about the picks. We've talked about the pros, the cons of each lineup. So let's go ahead and just hop right in. And what we're really going to be focusing on is just like general stuff. We talked a pretty good deal about the draft and like what plays into what and how it becomes powerful. Alright, I think I have a screen now. There we go. Alright. So the Tiny is going to be mid. And this changes the dynamic of how these lineups work and also how the lanes work. So if it was a support Tiny, then what you're basically getting out of the hero is diminished by a pretty sizable amount. So when you have a mid Tiny, you're getting really heavy bursts, the hero's going to be high level, and you're going to have a Blink Dagger supposedly a lot sooner, right? Like your dagger is just going to come out, and you're going to be killing side lanes and doing all this cool stun toss combo stuff and really applying a lot of pressure. If it ended up being a mid Viper, what you're getting out of that is just a much tankier version of what you would ordinarily get anyway, which is just a way to apply break, really good way to push the wave, and then later on you have that like Viper Strike into another Toxin combo that would kill the Tide or the Spectre relatively easy, so long as they're not able to walk out of the spray. So what it means for bottom lane is that instead of a Tiny lane, which is pretty easy to deal with as a safe laner, we now have a Viper lane. Now, anyone who's ever played against Viper in any lane already knows that it's a bit of a nightmare. So for the the overall game dynamic, the bottom lane is going to be way harder because it's a Viper instead of a Tiny. And most people who've played Dota probably knew that already, but might be some new people watching the video. And the Viper Bounty Hunter lane, let's just say this is nightmare fuel for any safe laner. Like, we don't want to ever see Bounty Hunter really when we're playing Spectre, and we definitely don't want to see Viper, and both of them are going to be occupying the same part of the map as that hero. So that puts that lane at a huge disadvantage. We could say that it is double countered by the heroes that Dire have. And then the top lane we have the Tidehunter Rubik lane. Now with a Luna and a Pudge, I would say it's likely that the Luna lane will eventually get a little bit of momentum because of how much damage they're going to be dealing with the Lunar Blessing, especially like level 3 or 4. But at the early levels, it's kind of hard for Pudge to have a tremendous impact against these two heroes. And if the Tide decides to skill Gush, then the Pudge could very easily just be the guy who kind of falls over. And then in mid, this is more of a... These heroes are going to get what they get. Invoker, once he gets levels, is going to be more or less unharassable, but he's still susceptible to being bursted, so if the Tiny gets like a combo or a hook from a side lane or something like that, then, you know, he could very easily be killed. So we're at about 1:30. What we're going to do is we're going to pause for a second, and we're going to talk about, if you're in a game like this, what can you expect? Like, if we're thinking about game plans and how we're going to counterplay our opponents, what are the things that are likely to happen based on what heroes we see? I would say that it's very likely that Dire are going to want to pressure the safe lane tier 1 very quickly. Now, this is a very common thing. Even if you didn't see a Luna, or you didn't see like Bounty Hunter or any of these aggressive heroes, you would probably still see some movement like that. But it's even more important for this style, where you have the Pudge, the Bounty Hunter supports, and then you have a mid-Tiny, because the towers being alive is in of itself a way of stopping pressure. Obviously, you're not going to walk into a tier 2 if a tier 1's still alive, right? So the easiest way to apply pressure is to get that building, use the lane advantage that you've gained for yourselves through your picks, because Viper Bounty is really powerful against basically anything that you could feel that would be kind of a rough lane. But especially because it's a Wyvern and a Spectre, two heroes that they don't really have a way of stopping this Viper from hitting creeps, and they also don't really have a way of protecting themselves if the Tiny were to make a rotation. So, with that being said, if I were Radiant, what's my counterplay? Like, what's the thing that I want to think about doing? If I'm the Invoker, and maybe bottom is playing too aggressive, I could TP if I have, like, my Tornado, my EMP, and my Cold Snap. Those spells, in conjunction with two slows from the safe lane, make sense, right? Like Cold Snap plus Arctic Burn plus Dagger and an EMP. That is likely to result in you being able to get a counter kill if one of these heroes gets a little bit too far forward. So we would say, if Dire want to push bottom, and we have a means of punishing a bad dive, then we want to keep an eye out on that lane, right? That's how you counter gameplay. You think about what the enemy team wants to do, and then you make a response based on what your heroes can do, and then you kill them for it, or in some cases, if they didn't have the tools to be able to defend this tower, they would just leave it. But it's my assessment currently that killing the safe lane tower is like the best way to apply pressure. So, we talked about the bot lane, we can talk a little bit about mid. This lane is, I don't want to say it's a complete wash, but both these heroes are going to get something. And both these heroes are going to play the map. So, the mid rotations are going to matter a lot for the overall pace of the game, like who does what and when, and what those kills result in. I sincerely doubt that mid towers are going to die early because, well, to be frank, the heroes on Radiant are just really bad at rotating. Like, Wyvern and Rubik don't rotate more or less at all, and if they do, it's more or less to save, and those rotations just don't feel useful, right? Like, you're not a Shadow Shaman, you're not a Lion, you're not any of these heroes who offer multiple forms of CC. You kind of do low attack damage, and your spells aren't super value at low level. So, obviously, if the Tiny is diving mid, you might still see a TP, but these heroes innately do not want to make that sort of move. So what that means is there's going to be a lot less focus on stuff happening in the mid lane from Radiant, and more focus on the Invoker as Quas Wex making plays happen elsewhere and trying to pull attention maybe away from that lane. So if the Spectre needs to rotate away, then they can do that. And then for top lane, we have the Pudge Luna versus Tide Rubik lane. This is also kind of a wash. And in this particular game, Tide Rubik is not a huge amount of kill threat. So there are some lanes in the off lane where you'll see like Mars Lina, or heck, even Tide Lina, just a bunch of nukes and slows and stuns, perhaps some minus armor. And that can really scare a lot of safe lane heroes from making them feel uncomfortable and wanting to leave. In this game, it is very possible that Dire could keep this tower alive for a very long time, because there's not a whole lot of kill pressure being applied by the enemy, whereas the reverse is true for Radiant. Like, they can die so easily in their safe lane if they mess up. A couple of extra auto attacks from Viper, Bounty Hunter gets a good Janata, and a Shuriken toss, a tiny TP, that kind of stuff. They can very, very easily die. So when you've made that like mental note of how the lanes are going to play, then you can adapt, whatever style you want to do. In this case, I would say that Radiant probably has less moves on the map that they can make just inherently, because their supports are what you would call slow. And slow just really means they don't do stuff on their own, and they don't really have powerful spells prior to level 6. Whereas Dire's supports, like a well-landed hook, can just kill a guy, right? And Bounty Hunter is going to apply pressure because he's fast and he's hitting the melee core in the safe lane with Janata, and he's getting value out of that stuff just innately. So we got that out of the way. We can go back to playing the game. Hopefully Directed Cam takes over and shows us something here shortly. Now this is the sort of stuff that you expect to see in any Invoker versus melee hero matchup. A very liberal use of EMP. Tiny's obviously a low mana hero, so anytime you can throw out a spell and drain a strength hero's mana, or even in some cases an agi hero that happens to be mid. The Invoker is going to just be doing everything he can to halt pressure. Take rune control away from the Tiny, mana drain the Tiny, TP react if it seems reasonable. All these plays that are going to allow the Spectre as much time as possible to be able to play the game. And bottom more or less plays itself for Dire. If they wanted to, they could just hard pressure the lane and just spam Nether Toxin, because there's not really a counterplay to putting Nether Toxin on the ground for Radiant. The bad thing is, it would put the wave under the tower pretty consistently, and if you're supposed to win a lane, that could be construed as a bad thing, because pushing the wave under tower means that sometimes you're just feeding the core CS, depending on the support matchup especially. Alright, so the Bounty Hunter has rotated away.
A spectacular gun!
And it looks like Spectre is going to get a kill because of the rotation. So they identified that the Bounty Hunter left the lane extremely quickly, and then they just go on the Viper straight up. If the Bounty Hunter is sitting in lane with the Viper, that play basically can't happen. But because the 4-player decided to move, and I think he placed his sentry in the time that he walked away from the lane, they were able to say, hey, this guy doesn't have a support, let's kill him, and they get first blood. Which is really big for the lane. Like, normally you would never expect to see this happen. If both players are on the same page and the Bounty's just chilling and the Viper like backs up or whatever when the Bounty Hunter goes to the side, then that kill probably doesn't happen either. So here, a couple of auto attacks, should be a dead Wyvern, pretty easy kill. But this is why I say that this lane has the highest volatility for kills, because mid lane's just going to be a lot of mana drain spam. Tiny obviously can't kill heroes without mana. And then top lane, I suppose there could be a kill on like the Rubik or the Pudge, but it's pretty unlikely that either of the cores are going to die. So that really just leaves bottom with the double slow and the harass. And it's also more likely because the mid players are probably going to be looking at that lane over the top lane. So again, the Bounty Hunter is gone, and the Viper just kind of explodes. This is something that you always have to be thinking about too. If you're in a counter lane, a lane where your hero matchup is supposed to be favored, then a lot of the time it's usually just best to abuse that as much as you can. So the Viper's died 2 times already in a little under 5 minutes. And most of that is either just due to like not communicating, maybe he's not respecting the amount of slow and damage they can deal, or the bounty hunter is just like not around enough. But if you can identify that your hero is in danger if your 4 is not around and you can stand further away, then you can very easily prevent this kind of stuff from happening. So a little bit of tower dive going on. Bottom, they're going on the Viper again. This time the bounty is actually there. But the bounty is actually setting up some vision for the Tiny. So I would say that it's acceptable for the bounty to be making these moves as long as he's establishing vision for the mid hero. Because the Tiny is going to be the one that comes online and starts doing stuff around the map. And we can actually talk about like all this stuff that's happening right now. So to the person who might be a little bit inexperienced, if you know as a support that the mid players are going to be the impact heroes, then if you make that judgment, then you want to enable those players, right? So we know that the Quaswex Invoker and we know that the Tiny are going to be the guys going around the map making shit happen. That's good. So what can we do to make these heroes have an even better time? We can help them secure the runes. And every time we get like an actual power rune, which the first one will be spawning in 10 seconds, or a bounty rune, and we get that mana, and we get that HP for the mid player, he's going to have a better game. And the better of a game that he has, the more likely that he's going to get his item timings at a point where it is impactful and he makes space and kills all these heroes, and then the map control starts swinging heavily in your direction. So because we have a Luna in the safe lane, we know that this hero can eventually just collapse into the jungle, rotate away, maybe go mid, sit there, kill some creeps, you know, wherever the Luna feels safe, they can go there, and that lane should be for them. And anyone else who is there should just be gone, right? At least from your own team. So if that's the case, then I can make the distinction that if I leave the Luna, and the wave is super pushed out like this, all the way at the tier 1, as you can see on the bottom left, then this rotation, securing a rune for my Tiny, is really big. So they've made this connection, and then the Radiant support feels the same. The difference is that Rubik as a hero is not just... he's just not as powerful, right? So he gets the lift, he tries to prevent the rune going to the Tiny, and Pudge as a 5 is actually a lot scarier in terms of stats and abilities, because if you get hit by a hook, it can just kill you. But a lot of the time, you get hit by a lift, and you're just like, whatever, you know? Like, lift doesn't do damage. Fadebolt does a little bit, but a level 3 hero is not really that scary. So when you see these kind of chaotic situations, what's really happening is the supports and the mid players are playing in tandem to try to reach a common goal, which is just, hey, rune control for these tempo heroes is really important. If you don't get runes, and you're playing a Tiny or some other bottle hero against an Invoker, your game's going to feel worse, right? You're going to be out of mana. You're going to be looking at your side lanes going, gee, I wish I could help you, but I just don't have any mana left. So everyone has kind of made that like connection in their brain, and then they're like all walking here at the same time. They even push out top first. They do all this stuff. Nice little defensive tornado. But the other cool thing about this move is that not only does it potentially secure the bounty, it secures hopefully a power rune. Now there, the RNG favored Radiant. So that means that the Tiny is not going to get a bottle fill from the aggressive rune, but since the Pudge is over there, he's able to pick up the bounty rune regardless. Now he knows after taking that mid fight that the Rubik doesn't have any mana, doesn't have any HP. It is impossible for them to contest. So when we're referring to like the counterplay, it's that the 5 on Dire is so much more powerful in a skirmish right now than the 4 player from Radiant. So they've assessed like the power levels, like, okay, there's no way they're going to do enough damage to kill the Tiny and a Pudge with a Rubik and a Quaswex Invoker. They just simply do not have the damage. So the counterplay is to get rune control because they can't kill you. And if they did, it's because it was a huge commitment from Radiant. Like, Wyvern would have to TP, the Tide would have to be there, like, all these things would have to happen in order for these heroes to be punished for this move.
Earned a Wyvern's gratitude.
So it's counterplaying like the greedy nature of Radiant supports being 2 like backline heroes by going for these sort of not really over-aggressive, but just like general aggressive like rune gathering and controlling and stuff like that. And so far, the Spectre and the Viper are having a more or less even lane, which is... I mean, it's obviously good for the Spectre, but the downside is that Spectre is still countered by Viper, even outside of the lane, which is something that most players will probably already know, but if you don't... Nether Toxin disables 2 abilities of Spectre, Dispersion and the Desolate. So, when you don't have those abilities, which are your bread and butter for being able to stay alive and deal damage, it makes your hero feel a lot worse. Right, you're just removing 2 skills. Nice little hook here. Should be a dead wyvern.
Jams it in.
All right, so let's talk about the philosophy behind the move from Dire. The movement makes sense because the Luna's not playing the lane anymore. The Tide is 6, and the Luna doesn't have a ward. Right? Luna doesn't have a ward. If we're trying to counter what the enemy team is doing, we want to try to apply pressure to the Spectre. Now, the problem with the move is that the Viper was not nearby. If the Viper is there, then that move becomes a lot harder to deal with as Radiant, right? Because then you're thinking about, okay, maybe I have to TP Invoker, maybe I have to TP Tide, you know, one of these things to keep the Wyvern alive. But because the Luna is not interested in playing the lane anymore in top, then if you know that your goal is to apply pressure to make sure that you're, you know, constantly making something happen on the map, then making the rotation to the enemy's safe lane is usually just the easier move to make. Because the safe laners are not known for being very strong, especially at 8 minutes. So you're trying to make kills happen, you know, get Bounty Hunter 6, get Pudge 6, do all this kind of cool stuff. And then hopefully, you know, your Tiny's Blink Dagger timing is going to be pretty quick, and he's already at 1,300 gold, so it shouldn't be too bad.
Look, the Dire's top tower is under attack.
The other thing we can quickly mention is that even in a game... Oh, nice little duster. Bounty Hunter is actually just going to be dead.
Come on!
Bounty Hunter is just going to be dead. That was a nice response. If I were to have any critique for Dire right now, it's that these heroes are just not playing together. Like, the Pudge is going with the Bounty, and then the Bounty is going solo, and the Viper is not even in the lane, right? Like, there's just a huge lack of communication between the players. And they're just not playing the same space. If they're together, it's a lot easier. Like, again, this guy is just kind of alone. Defensive Viper Strike buys a little bit of time. Should be a dead Rubik. Alright, so they get a kill. First rotation of the game from the Tiny. 9 minutes, makes it down. And then, as we talked about in the beginning, TP response from the Invoker. Throws out a Tornado EMP. And he's actually not going to get a kill. That is unfortunate. So they are just like full on like tower diving at this point, right? Just going as hard as they can to try to get kills here and apply pressure. But you can see that Radiant really does lack damage. Especially when the Invoker is dead. Like, the damage that they can deal is just non-existent. So, like, again, if you're not, like, super... Well, let's just say if you're newer to the game. You look at a situation like this and you go, wow, how did that happen? You know, how did it escalate? The short of it is, they hit the timing, right? Bounty Hunter's close to 6. Tiny rotates bottom with a rune. The Invoker probably anticipates that this rotation is coming well before it actually happens, right? Because it's just how Dire want to play the game. So to try to counter the aggression, they TP. They send the Invoker down. The Invoker tries to kill the Pudge. He doesn't get the kill. It's like one hit away. But philosophically, as far as Dota goes, trying to defend the tier 1 in this type of game it's doable, but it's difficult, right? You land all your spells perfectly. Maybe the Tide should have TP'd. You know, this guy had Ravage even before this dive ever happened. So you could make two different arguments. You could say, well, maybe we just let the tower die. which personally I think is wrong. I think you want to try to defend it this game because you have a Tidehunter. And then the other one is, well, we should hold it because if the T1s fall, then the map control that we have gets even worse. And it's very hard to play this kind of sit far away lineup like Invoker and Rubik and Wyvern want to do against constant aggression. You're like always being ran at, people throwing stuns at you, throwing hooks at you. Tiny's going to have a blink probably within the next 60 seconds to 2 minutes. So if you wanted to try to stop it, the best way to do so would be to have your guy that's really good at standing in front when he has his like peak power ability, which is Ravage. Just have that guy be there. Like if he's just there and they have Ravage and Dust and all this other stuff and this dive happens, it could very easily be punished. Or they could just as easily walk away instead of going for the kills when they see Tide. But the issue stems from the Tide not being present, the enemy team like going for this dive, and then, you know, no response from the offlane hero. So that's kind of a problem as far as what needs to happen in the game for Radiant to have a good win condition. Because even though this tower isn't taking any damage, these kills are still really bad because they're track kills. And 2 heroes are more or less at 10% HP. So if you're trying to counter aggression, and then you pick a hero that is very good at standing in a place, and then you don't stand in that place when you're needed, then you're not really countering, right? You're just kind of like, you've picked the hero with an idea, but you're not executing on it. So it's 10 minutes. There's not really much of a gold lead to speak of right now. It's like a 1k-ish difference. But the state of the game is going to change drastically now. Even like with that whole thing that happened, the Luna was counter pressuring mid, which is a really important thing for any safe laner. Like the Tide wasn't bottom, right? The Tide was pushing top. He was pulling the wave. So the safe lane player identifies that the best way to enable my team, even if I'm just hitting creeps, is to take a tower off the map that prevents aggression. And the T1 in the mid lane is the most important tower on the map, period. So that rotation to kill a tower, and then also losing those heroes, including our Spectre on a kill streak to track, and then the T1 dying. All those things, you look at the gold and you go, it doesn't really seem like it matters that much, but from a gameplay standpoint, it matters a whole heck of a lot. Because now there's all these separate avenues into that jungle, and sitting in the mid lane all of a sudden feels a lot worse if you're Radiant. And now, you know, Dire are going to be going again, and they're going to be sending heroes to the same part of the map, you know, throwing out tracks, going for dives, all this stuff. Yeah, and there's the Blink Dagger, so the Rubik just explodes. Now the Tide is actually here this time. So they're going to be able to get a counter kill on the Viper. So like this play from Radiant is much better than the previous defense that we saw. Like this one makes their lineup look like it's playable, right? Because the Tide was there. He didn't even have to use the Ravage. He was just there, and it halted the aggression. The Invoker got a nice little Tornado EMP combo, got a Cold Snap. They killed the Viper and the Pudge. And that's why, like, talking about counters and, like, gameplay counters matters so much, because if you don't know this stuff... this Invoker may be dead. I guess the Tiny doesn't have mana. But if you don't know this stuff in advance, and that dive happens and the Tide ignored it twice, then this game could have been out of hand just because of those 2 plays. And Luna is more or less just going for the... I think whenever you have a Dragonlance on Luna, what you're really saying is I want to be able to contribute a bit earlier. Like if you buy a Dragonlance and you're going for this Manta style build, you're really trying to hit towers, right? Like you're trying to pressure, you're trying to maybe attend some earlier fights with your team, whereas Luna is... It's usually acceptable for Luna to farm for quite a while, as long as her ulti's not up. In this sort of game, I feel like that's not going to be the case. Alright, so we got another combo here, more aggression coming out, some track kills. And this is also another really nice move as well. So this is this is really good by Radiant because they know that being against an aggressive lineup that outnumbering them is one of the best ways to win a fight. And if there's like cores showing in the top lane, cores showing in the bottom lane, and then you see this Tiny diving a tier 2, you know that there's only so much help that that guy can get, right? So if the Viper's showing top, Luna's showing bottom, Tiny's at your T2, well, they probably just can't help him, so let's kill him. And like killing the Tiny is really big, because that is one of the best heroes, and honestly at this point really the only hero that is good at getting in and like killing the Wyvern, killing the Rubik, and preventing them from getting their kit off during an engagement. So when those heroes are dead, the map pressure is relieved from the Radiant team. It's actually quite good for Radiant that they've managed to keep their tower alive for this long. 14.5 minutes. That's actually quite a long time for this tower to be up, especially against a Luna lineup. So looks like we're gonna have another fight. Nice little Ravage. They go on the Luna. And should be dead, I believe. Yep, another nice little fight here. This time they were fighting into Ravage, so it's a little bit more difficult. But yeah, these defenses are really good. Like, their AoE spell usage has been great. Like, that Ravage hit basically everybody. And the Viper wasn't there at the beginning of the fight, and the Luna also got clipped by the spells. So, again, very nice defense. Keeping the tower alive for even longer. The way that you can view it is this. The longer that Radiant has map control, the better chance they have of winning the game. That's probably true for most games, but it's especially true when you're playing against a lineup that is supposed to be oppressive. They're supposed to take away the control. They're supposed to restrict your map and remove the vision and make you feel scared to move out. So, my assumption is that they're just going to go again. Mainly because Curse and Ravage are both down, and Haunt actually. So this is normally the time in the game where, again, this video is more about like gameplay philosophies and countering and like what you can do to prevent stuff from happening in the game. But there is a common misconception that a lot of players have at virtually every bracket in the game, that if you lose a fight, that you can't just go fight again. Let's just go ahead and dispel that notion. The notion that if you lose a engagement, that it's impossible for you to just go and fight them immediately after. In fact, against these styles of lineups that Radiant have, the best time to fight is right after a fight just occurred, regardless of whether or not you've won or lost, assuming you have the heroes available. Because now, this tower is undefendable. Ravage is down, Haunt is down, no Curse, right? So if they come here, at this point, this tower will still probably be dead, and in addition they will hemorrhage kills. So you can already tell by the positioning on the map and top, like Spectre's not even over there, on the complete opposite side, actually farming under a ward, and the Invoker is mid. So there's not really much intention of Radiant for looking at this tower and saying, yeah, we gotta hold this, right? Because they just committed all their spells and got a bunch of kills, and they slowed the pace of the game, right? It's okay that this tower dies now because it stayed alive for so long, and they got, I would say, like 2.5 defense fights that went pretty well. But I can't see... Yeah, I can't see them really putting forth much of a defense here. So it's good recognizing that when you're playing against cooldown-driven lineups that you are actually playing the map in the downtime of the abilities that are going to fight you. Because it's very common for a lot of different skill levels of players to fight once, get crushed in that fight because they fight into a bunch of ults, then not fight for like another 5 minutes, and then go back in and repeat the same thing. This is obviously a very high level game, so you're not gonna see the same stuff happen that you would in those types of games. Invoker's gonna go for a TP. Ooh. This is a nice movement from Dire. I believe their ward kind of scouted him, and they get the kill. So because the Invoker is dead, it is going to be a little bit harder for Radiant to really hold much of anything for the next like 20 seconds, but their ults are going to be up very soon. So this pressure that is like continually being applied, it can't really stop. Like Dire doesn't have a plan B. It's just go fight, throw out tracks, try to get our Luna as much farm as possible, and if that doesn't win us the game, then we will probably just not win the game. Alright, so they're going to go for a smoke play. I don't believe the Tide has gone for a blink. No, he hasn't. He's going for a X. Okay. But so far, both teams, even though there's been like some miscommunications from Dire, I'd say, more so than Radiant, like they have an idea of what their lineups are meant to do. And that's very telling, you know, when you're watching low-level games, there's a lot of like running around and not really understanding what to do. I actually really like this rotation, and I'll say why. So, from the standpoint of how Radiant's lineup functions, what are they really bad at dealing with? They're really bad at dealing with quick movements across the map. They have no catch, right? So when you see a bunch of heroes in your own jungle, and then you have this ward covering the Spectre, smoking and killing that guy is so much more effective than throwing your bodies into a tier 2 when you know that the Radiant team has all these spells available to be able to hold that point, right? So this kill just removes the win condition from the enemy team off the map for like a full minute. And then when they respawn, you could already have a defensive posture if you could get one like quickly enough to like restrict his movement for even longer, or, you know, take a Roche if your team is capable of doing that, or even get a tower. You know, there's a bunch of things you can do. But what this move says is that we're going to use the vision that we have, and we're not going to fight into a choke, into all these very dangerous spells. We're going to take your core off the map, and we're going to just hold the map until we find like another opportunity, maybe or something like this, or, you know, maybe they go in after with another smoke and try to catch a hero. But this movement is very, very good. I like it quite a bit. Yeah, you can even see the Spectre pings the ward. He's like, yeah, there's definitely a ward here. Some defensive dewarding. Making sure that the triangle is safe to farm for the Spectre player and Radiant. It's always a nice thing to prioritize.
What have we here?
Looks like the Viper is going to be the sacrificial lamb again. Now these deaths aren't really like... They're not good deaths, because nothing is really happening in return other than Luna's getting some creeps. But at the same time, it's quite hard for them to like walk into this powerhouse team fight thing. And if you're trying to play the map efficiently and your other heroes aren't with you, then someone at some point is going to encounter a death. It's just kind of how Dota works. If you spread your resources too thin and the enemy team is sending numbers at you, there's a good chance that you're just going to lose a hero. That's even more true when the enemy team has high amounts of catch, like blink stuns, you know, silences, whatever. That kind of compounds the issue. But Radiant aren't particularly good at punishing this sort of thing, so they're only able to really get the slow hero, which is the Viper. Like, Luna's quite fast, can probably just run away. Tiny can stun and toss and maybe defend himself a little bit. But Viper is what we would call the freebie. He's just a guy who's really slow and has a hard time running away from any sort of aggression. I would assume that once the BKB is out here on Luna, we're going to see some action taken by Dire. This is the stage in the game where, as Radiant, you're feeling pretty confident in being able to take an engagement if you can get one. That's the important caveat here. Like, can you get the fight? The fight that you're looking for is the one where they're running into you, because all your spells are best used in either choke points or they're used defensively, right? Like, Rubik and Wyvern want to sit in the back, and Invoker wants to sit in the back. We've talked about this before. But these heroes excel when they can sit and see what's happening and then use their spells accordingly. So we got a little bit of a scuffle in the mid lane. Looks like Spectre has hit a Radiance timing here. Gets the kill on the Pudge. So they used Haunt, and they basically got a 5 kill, which doesn't feel amazing. But they only really had to commit one ulti. So getting 1 kill for 1 ult is probably not the worst outcome, because it kind of forces Dire off the map as well. There's a huge thing in Dota where, even if your lineup is meant to kill, holding the map and like forcing the opponent to be in an uncomfortable position and not be efficient is still good. It's just that a lot of people have the mentality that if no one's dying, then their game's not going well. That's not universally true. In this game, if we look at just like net worth, the Luna is still pulling ahead. Like, this hero inherently farms way faster than the Spectre is ever going to be able to, especially pre-Radiance. So until recently, this Spectre's been farming a lot slower. And now this Luna has the Dragon Lance, the Manta, the BKB timing. Her hero has reached what people will call like a power spike. And that refers to just a hero's strength getting much, much higher after completing a specific item that either grants like magic immunity or a team fight item or something of that vein. And that Spectre is going to just explode. So here, this was a timing that they were not prepared for, plus positioning not being that good on the Radiant heroes. So the Spectre gets exploded because the Wyvern's not close enough, you know, the Tide's not close enough, the Tide doesn't have a dagger. And then once the Spectre's dead, that is a huge amount of their damage, so the fight no longer looks winnable. Yeah, this Tide is just not tanky at all against these heroes. And as we mentioned earlier, Cold Embrace into a hook. It's one of the main reasons why Pudge is good against Wyvern. Normally, as Wyvern, you're trying to save somebody when you put him in Cold Embrace, but Pudge can just pull you even further out of position, and then you end up being dead. It was also a very nice heads-up play by the Tiny to recognize that if the Tide were to Ravage after that toss, it would just be a waste. Because there was no damage alive to apply through the Ravage. Some people would view this as, wow, he just hooked the Tide into his team, why didn't he just Ravage? Well, the truth is, there's really only 2 heroes that can apply any sort of kill pressure on Radiant. One of them is the Invoker, which isn't that much, and then Spectre. Oh, man. Okay, this is really bad. Unfortunately for Spectre, she is tracked, so it's going to be quite hard to get away from this. Yeah, he's just going to die twice. Alright, so the Ravage lands. Unfortunately, not enough damage. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to pause. We're going to pause and we're going to talk about the last couple of things that happened. In the mid lane, the Spectre was sitting there farming creeps on a mid wave, expecting her team to be closer in proximity than they were. So when the Spectre got jumped and died immediately, her team was not able to respond. So we could say that they were not adequately prepared for that move to happen in the mid lane, which is fine. Like, 1 death is not... It's oftentimes not the end of the game. But this death is extremely bad for a bunch of different reasons. So the map sort of reset after the Spectre died the first time, and when the map resets, the most dangerous places you can be are next to towers. And when we say map reset, what we're saying is a fight has ended, everyone has gone to heal, or, you know, a lot of people have gone back to their, like, farming patterns or whatever. And sometimes you're going to see, like, a movement between when a map resets and the next play. So a really dangerous spot to be during these times is next to a place where a teleport scroll can be used. And that's basically exactly where the Spectre was. And the enemy team did a really nice read on his movement and trying to be there as soon as the Spectre was there and then kill her before her team was ready. Now, if it wasn't enough that the Spectre just dies twice in a row, the Tide has committed Ravage, they've committed Curse, and they essentially have no spells left, right? They just have nothing. So even if they were to kill the 2 supports, this fight can never feel good for Radiant. It just can't. And in all likelihood, the Pudge and the Bounty Hunter probably won't even die. We're gonna watch the whole fight. But I would be very surprised if they lost the hero. Nice little hook attempt there. Tornado and the deafening to save. Just gonna walk away.
Too big, too fast,
Nice,
and
another
too
little
strong.
catch. Should be another kill.
Kaboom!
Okay.
Too big, too
So-
fast, and too strong.
We're gonna pause again, and we're gonna do a little bit more talking, and then I think we're gonna go ahead and wrap up the video. So, as far as counters, what we've seen this game is gameplay counter. We've seen hero picking counters, and we've seen itemization counters, all in the same game. Tiny, blink stun hero, very good at killing squishy supports. That's a counter. Dagger is a counter as well because it's an item that lets you close the gap because these heroes do not want you to be in front of them. For Viper, the counter is very straightforward. Viper good against heroes that have passives because Nether Toxin breaks them. It makes it very hard for heroes like Spectre to actually carry the game. As far as the last pick goes, I'd say Viper was an extremely good pick, and I wouldn't even say that this game was played particularly well by the Viper. It was just that his pick was really strong. And then, on the gameplay side, Dire really never stopped fighting, except for one moment when they decided to smoke under the ward to kill the Spectre. So we think about the Spectre's game. He's playing into a Viper, which is already really hard, right? It's not a matchup that you want. A Bounty Hunter who's going to be running at you, stun toss, a very fast farming core, and then a Pudge. So we have all these things that we have to be worrying about, and even if we get farm, there's a good chance that we're not really going to be able to carry without some sort of like outside assistance, right? Now this game isn't unwinnable. Radiant definitely had a lot of good defense efforts put forth, especially towards the tier 1 in the bot lane. But as far as countering goes, I would say that Dire's lineup is favored to win this game maybe 7 out of 10 times. Because it's just really easy for them to walk into the jungle and occupy space and fight during cooldowns and make all these moves, right? But it's important that when we're talking about this too, that you guys understand that they know it already. And if you don't know how to play it, well then hopefully you've learned a little bit from this video in regards to what you can do or what should be done in what situations based on what heroes you have. But obviously, countering in general is a very complicated subject, as most things in Dota are. There are exceptions to every rule. Everything is complicated in this game. That's just how it is, and that's why, you know, everybody loves it. So, thank you guys for hanging out. Hope you guys walked away with a little bit more Dota knowledge today. Thank you guys very much for tuning in. If you guys want to catch me live, you can do so at twitch.tv/Draskyl, same as in the YouTube. Hope you're having a wonderful day, and we'll see you very soon.